so let's start with the poll. Was the first science fiction author A, H.G. Wells? Let's see. 1866 to 1946, writer of such classics like The Time Machine, War of the Worlds, or, please. Next slide, please. Jules Verne, 1820 to 1905, wrote Around the World in 80 Days, 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Anybody's choice? Robertson History of Science Fiction says that Jules Verne was our first master of techno-fiction, which became the predominant way that people understood science fiction in the 20th century. So there's a case for that. How about, next slide, please. Mary Shelley, who, 1797 to 1851, author of Frankenstein, which she wrote in a weekend, which I have to say was a big inspiration to me on Friday when I remembered I had this today. Brett Rogers, in his reception of science fiction, reception of the classical world in science fiction, makes a case for her. How about D, please? Johannes Kepler, with that massive beard. I love him. He wrote the Somnium, which has an account of what it would have been like to travel to the moon. And it actually has some really cool little details like how to pack. Like we know it's cold the further up you get, so you should pack a sweater when you're going to the moon. It's awesome. Now, Isaac Asimov and Carl Sagan are the ones who argue that he was the first science fiction author. Next slide, please. There's E. Giordano Bruno, who's a real favorite of the neo-atheist movement. You may have seen him on Cosmos. He was held up in the same breath, in fact, in the same segment as Galileo Galilei, because he was a mystic who had this interesting, he pursued the implications of Catholic doctrine, because now that we're seeing all these stars, what if those stars are actually suns like our own, and what if they have their own planets? Well, there's only two things we can say about that. Either A, there are people on those planets who never got the good news, never met Jesus, and so God is cruel for condemning billions upon billions to only be in purgatory and never achieve heaven. Or B, there were Jesus on all the planets, and everyone got redeemed, which means that ours wasn't so special. So the Catholic Church responded in the perfectly rational way of battering and frying him. He was burned at the stake in 1600. Okay. All right. Next slide, please. Clearly, it's none of these, because it's going to be the way I'm going to start this talk. So it's, as Admiral Akbar tells us, it is a trap. So next slide, please. All right. So part of the reason why we have all these debates over what counts as science fiction is a lot of this sort of terminological stuff I started dealing with. So let's start with some definitions of terminology. First off, science fiction, which you may know as sci-fi or sci-fi, like that cable channel, SYFY. I really hated when they made that logo, but I'm a classics professor. I will actually be using the term SF more frequently, because a lot of people who write in the genre, like William Gibson, who wrote Neuromancer, thinks it's a juvenile term. So he prefers SF. It sounds a lot classier that way. So I'll be using SF throughout this, and it's sometimes grouped with a lot of other genres under the umbrella of speculative fiction. Now, the term speculative fiction also has a very good pedigree, because Robert Heinlein, who wrote Stranger in a Strange Land, and if you're not nodding to that, you probably know the movie Starship Troopers, that I think is probably the reason why he's most known today, which I find a little sad. But it really is an excellent send-up of Heinlein's basic ideas that in order to be a citizen, you need to serve in the military. Like that's a core concept that's pursued in that book. And so Heinlein, when he uses the term speculative fiction, when he coins it in the 50s, he's referring to the way that authors will take a technology from today and then speculate over what impact that will have on future societies. I mean, unfortunately, the term, I think, has been watered down to the point of meaninglessness, because when people use speculative fiction, they're also talking now about historical alternative history fiction, like Man in the High Castle. Amazon made a show out of a very short story, and it posits what would the 60s have been like if the Germans and the Japanese had won World War II. Or there's a movie that's going to be coming out soon that came from a Reddit thread. would a battalion of Marines be able to take down the Roman Empire if they were sent back to the time of Augustus? Yeah, I mean, it's the fellow who started the initial post, and now it's getting turned into a movie, basically said, probably not, because Marines require a lot of gasoline and bullets and stuff. And Romans, their technology is pretty simple. But so we can see how these two things might work together with SF, but I saw in a recent definition that they're also including Tolkien. And also, really, anytime that an author speculates, so basically fiction, right? So even though on my abstract that I sent, I used the term speculative fiction, it is entirely because I didn't do my homework before sending my abstract. So I will not be using that term now. In fact, I saw this really awful one that said Euripides' Medea was speculative fiction about, I'm going to try to get the right term here, a shamaness who envisions her children being killed by herself and not by the Corinthians, right? And as somebody who has studied the Medea multiple times and taught him it, I don't know where this Corinthian things come from, but I'm not the guy who wrote that post. So yes, so not speculative fiction because it doesn't really work. So Brett Rogers, who's the guy who argued that Mary Shelley should be the first one, thinks that another better term might be knowledge fiction. Because in order to interpret what you're reading on the science fiction page, you have to know something about the initial technologies and then make these knowledge leaps. You have to fill in a lot of data. It's almost like an enthymeme, where one of the steps in an argument is suppressed, and you fill in that step that's missing, and it makes you buy into the argument a lot more. It's part of the reason why some politicians are really good at making people believe what they say, even though what they say is gibberish, because folks can fill in what's missing. And so his idea of knowledge fiction is one that I think works fairly well, although he's ultimately trying to, and he ultimately wants us to use the concept of knowledge fiction and the way of analyzing science fiction as a way of understanding the ancient world. Because the ancients are really very alien to us. We think that they're close to us. We see Brad Pitt speaking British in Troy, and we assume that it's that they are like us, but they are really a very strange people. So we should consider the ancient world much like knowledge fiction. Now, for me, I tend to align my definition with a fairly broad concept that what science fiction is more a philosophy, a way of ultimately construing meaning in the story. Tony Keane, who's a classicist, and he's British, so please forgive the use of whilst or whilst in this definition. I really like the way that he phrased it. So let me say that in my view, science fiction assumes a rational explanation to everything. No matter how fantastic it might seem or how pseudoscientific that explanation might be, whilst fantasy assumes the irrational. So gods that are in fact super powerful aliens are science fiction. Gods that are gods belong to fantasy. Right? And so his contrast with fantasy here, I think, is one that I'm going to be maintaining to help define the boundaries between science fiction and fantasy, because fantasy can have really strong rules. I'm a big fan of Jim Butcher's Dresden Files, where it's set in contemporary Chicago, and there are these very elaborate rules about how the world of fairy can interact with their own world and how magic works. And so it's not to say that there aren't these rigid rules, but ultimately it is a fantastic way of understanding it. Ursula Le Guin is actually one of my favorite people who sort of hybridizes these two things, because in her Wizard of Earthsea series, her way of understanding magic is ultimately a linguistic one, that if you know the true name for something, you have power over it. And I've not seen this argued, but because it's something I've recently sort of thought about. It's the way the Stoics view language. So she's in some way picking up this ancient concept. Because the Stoics thought that the way that language worked is that there's basically like a machine language that covers the world and is inside our brain. And the way that we communicate with each other is an overlay on top of that. So if we could just pierce down to the machine language, then we can have primal control over everything. All the elements of the world and each other. And so that's why Stoics were the first people to really work into linguistics, and we might even say psycholinguistics. If you want to, what I think is a really funny parody, Plato's Rhesus. has a guy who makes all these incredibly absurd arguments over why words are shaped the way that they are, like even down to the shapes of the letters. It's pretty funny. But so Le Guin, in taking this idea that through language we can gain this control, she is sort of bridging between these two elements, because on the one hand there's this fantastical element, but also it's ultimately grounded in a rational basis. So I'd argue that Wizard of Earthsea, which has wizards and dragons, is ultimately, in this view, more of a science fiction novel than a fantasy novel. So I think it's misplaced on your shelves at BAM. All right. So again, ultimately, again, rational basis, things that are all these explanatory models that are based in the world, in the natural. This is what I'm using as my way of categorizing science fiction, and then everything that has this sort of supernatural component or an explanatory model that relies upon things that are outside of the word supernatural, fit that. Let's see. I've already griped about Neil deGrasse Tyson, so I'll skip that bit about Bruno. But one thing I want to say about people like Tyson who think that Bruno is a martyr for science, right? I really think he's a martyr for mysticism, a martyr for implications of doctrine, a martyr for philosophy, perhaps. That I think that the ultimate thing that he does get us is to a hypothesis or a thesis, the thesis of Roger's book on the history of science fiction, where he makes this argument that because the Catholic Church responded so vigorously to scientific revelations that conflicted with their doctrine, it is one reason why fantasy novels became really popular in Catholic countries, especially as science fiction starts to begin, and that Protestant countries, which have the sort of a basic materialist focus to the world and a denaturing of magic from ritual, that this is the reason why science fiction really takes hold in Protestant countries early on. So, there's more to his thesis than that, but I think that when we think about folks like Bruno and Galileo and early histories of science fiction, this I think is a provocative way of considering it. So, when I'm thinking about science fiction, one of the metaphors I'm going to be using is the metaphor of the black box. Next slide, please. Or the technical term, sorry, next slide, please. I forgot I put a gap in there. Yes. So our back one, please. Thank you. So the black box concept of science fiction basically asserts that there is, science fiction allows an author to comment on contemporary ideas, right? And what they do is they take whatever concerns they want to have, they run it through a black box, and then out the other side is whatever technology, or the technical term novum, or you would say novum because you all are AD people, but the novum it just means Latin for the new thing, right? So whatever this new thing is, whatever this strange thing is going to be used as a way of helping define what are the specific items that we have there. So we think about Spock's ears. I was in a science fiction class, and my professor to a room of 300 people said, "So why does Spock have pointed ears?" And a guy stood up and he said, "Well, it's because Vulcan is a desert planet, and it's an evolutionary adaptation to be able to hear sounds across the desert so much better." And the professor said, "Well, I just want to hear he's a Vulcan, right?" And everyone gave this guy standing applause. Floyd, I remember the guy's name still. I wonder whatever happened to him. But yeah, so when we see Spock, who is marked by his ears, indicating to us that he is not human, and then we see through his behavior this sort of hyper-rational, completely logical way of being, it's an excellent foil and contrast to the overly emotional characters like Bones and Kirk. So the Noam there of his ears gives us this model of what a real human is, just like in the sort of second image there, where we've got Data and his son Mark Zuckerberg, who both show us what humans are not, to help us figure out what humans actually are. Or the Novum could be, I really love my Oculus headset. I'm sure it's going to be down by the time I get home tonight. Okay, so third image, we've got the protomolecule from The Expanse. right? So this sort of blue crystalline protomolecule has two main metaphorical uses. On the one hand, it's about, and this is complete science fiction from years ago, about humans' inability to respond to a disease outbreak that could ultimately threaten humanity. Again, I don't know where they come up with this stuff. But also, the people who get caught up in the protomolecule become spoilers, become part of a hive mind, right? And so one of the main themes of the series is this contrast between this hive mind that's able to accomplish what it wants to accomplish and the fact that humans facing extinction are still going to be petty and rely upon their sort of political differences. So there, the black box, again, really does speak to the issues of its time. And finally, things like Firefly, which we have here. What does that say? Does anybody? Do we know what those images mean? Oh, okay, great. Well, thank you. Yeah, I was sitting in the audience and reflecting on how this really does connect with this sort of this big broader issue. You know, when Joss Whedon creates Firefly, we hear this great mixture of Chinese and English throughout the series because it addresses the anxiety of Asia being on the rise. You know, China being a new superpower. That it used to be the case that when we saw things like the things that Return to the Forbidden Planet are based on, the future was American, right? We're the ones who landed on the moon, and then the future was going to be ours. But now this sort of polyglot vision of the future addresses these deep anxieties. So I think that the novum in Firefly, there are many of them, but one of them is I really think this use of language is important. Or on a silly level, in Battlestar Galactica, the use of frack for other. Is this where I get viral? Okay. Other primary obscenities, because we have this concern that people in the military oftentimes use salty language. Sailors use salty language because you are where you are. But if you're having a show that's on network TV, you can't use language like that. All right. So the thing I want you to keep in mind is that when we're thinking about science fiction, keep an eye out for what the novum is. ED. What the novum is, and then try to reverse engineer what is the story that the author is attempting to tell through this new item. Next slide, please. Which brings us now to Lucian of Samosata, who wrote what I say is the first-ish science fiction story. He lived from 120 to 180, so yes, he's post Pompeii, and I know something a little about him. And his story, the true history, is much like with Shakespeare. In many of Lucian's plots, he did not generate the story, but he produced it in a way that was worthy of memory, and something that's really fun. So, for example, in book 2 of the true history, we have a story of our main character and his men getting swallowed by a whale, right, which is probably familiar to you from Jonah, right. And actually, up until the early 70s, classes thought that Lucian was actually parodizing that until we found other references to people getting swallowed by whales in other literature. We don't actually have that literature. We have references to it in some grammarians, and so we know that he's taking these other ideas. And it's entirely possible that the story that we're going to be talking about today, which involves sailing up to the moon and Star Wars and sort of what life is like on other planets, that these are things that may have occurred before Lucian, but he is the version that we have. That's why I say it's the first-ish science fiction story. Now, the title of it is the true history, the Aletheia Diegesis, right? Diegesis just means sort of going through stuff. If you are of a biblical background, you might be familiar with the term exegesis. It's the same type of root. So dia through ex out. Now, aletheia is an interesting word here because we break that in half. So the meaning not, like an asynchronous, and the lethe part means forgetfulness. So things that are defined as true are things that are not forgotten, right? So I think this is a point worth dwelling on, that in the Greek, it does eventually come to mean truth. But when we first see it in Homer, it means, yeah, the stuff that is unforgotten. So unforgotten things must necessarily be true. Also, part of the reason why this is interesting is he name checks Herodotus a lot. Herodotus is our first historian. He is known to us as the father of history, but in the ancient world was known as the father of lies, because his historia comes from the root that comes from the word that both means to see and to know. Oida means like to see it in your mind's eye. And it's the oida root comes through Latin through video or video, right? So it's that same type of C word. But to the Greeks, you see it in your mind, but you also see it with your eyes. And what Herodotus says he did was engage in autopsy. Autopsy, in this case, means you auto yourself, like an automobile. Opsane, see it. So he claims that he went from place to place, and he collected these stories, and he sort of put his shape around to create a big narrative. Up until that point, the closest thing we had were people who just wrote annals of each year in various cities. But he's the first one to try to do a big overarching story. Well, so he has all these things that he claims are true, but there are many people, even in the ancient world, who were surprised that he saw large flying lizards or ants that would go fetch gold for muskrats. So there's a lot of things in there that seem somewhat preposterous in his story. And so by calling this the true story and name checking Herodotus right out at the beginning, we can see this sort of great double relation between lies and truth. And Lucian goes even further to make a claim that this is what should make him more appealing. So he says, quote, quote translated, I tell all kinds of lies in a plausible and specious way, but also because everything in my story is more or less a comical parody. But my lying is far more honest than theirs. For though I tell the truth and nothing else, I shall at least be truthful in saying that I'm a liar. I think that I can escape the censure of the world by my own admission that I am not telling a word of truth. So be it understood then that I am writing things which I have neither seen, autopsy, nor had to do with, nor learned from others, which in fact don't exist at all, and in the nature of things cannot exist. Therefore, my readers should on no account believe in them. Right? All right, so we talked about the aletheia, right? So the story that we have here is counterposed to other sorts of histories and to other people who've made these sort of claims on the world. And the frame that we have to the story is we have an unnamed narrator. We'll just call him Lucian for the sake of simplicity here. And he decides that he wants to see what is on the other side of the sea. Now, the Eratosthenes in the 3rd century BCE, so 500 years before Lucian, calculated the circumference of the world. And he did it in a fairly accurate way. He was within 5,000 miles. The problem that he had is he thought the world was perfectly round because the spheres are perfect. But since we are more like an oblong egg thing, that's why he was off. It's just a brilliant way that he wrote to a friend in Alexandria, and he was in Athens, and said, dig a pit of this length and this diameter, and on this particular day, I want you to measure how wide the shadow is in the bottom there. And so he took his own reading on his own day, and so by using trigonometry, by the difference in the length of shadows, assuming the world is a perfect sphere, that's how he calculated it. We also have, I think within 20,000 miles, the distance of the moon to the Earth. This was pretty fascinating. I just found this out this week. I've got a friend who's writing a book on ancient STEM, and she discovered that. So we have a fellow who wants to sail across the sea, because they knew how big Europe was. They had also circumnavigated Africa by the 1st century, by the end of the 1st century BCE. Pomponius Mela has a really amazing travelogue about that, which, if you can think about what Africa must have been like at the time, you can interpret these things that he didn't understand, like, well, we put in to get some water at the stream, and there were these small, hairy men in trees, and they started throwing bananas at us, and we had to leave. So there are things like that. So the idea that a guy would want to go and see what was on the other side of the ocean is something that is entirely sort of plausible, sort of plausible pursuit for this time. Okay, right. Yes. So here, this also connects with Roger's idea of the origins of science fiction. He says, I quote, "In other words, I'm arguing that the Ur form of the science fiction text is a story about interplanetary travel. It still seems to me the stories of journeying through space form the core of the genre, although Betty Grace would disagree. Travels upwards through space, or sometimes downwards into hollow Earth marvels, distinguished from more conventional travels across a plane, are the trunks of work from which the various other modes of science fiction branch off." Okay, so Lucian, next slide, please. So Lucian and his crew, he takes 50 men and a lot of food and weapons with him. They sail past the Pillars of Gibraltar, the Pillars of Hercules, and after about 80 days of sailing, a whirlwind takes the boat and lofts it 300 stages in the air, which is about 35 miles, and propels the boat forward for 7 days and 7 nights until they land on the moon. Quote, "For 7 days and 7 nights we sailed the air, and on the 8th day we saw a great country in it, resembling an island, bright and round and shining with a great light. Running in there and anchoring, we went ashore, and on investigating found this land was inhabited and cultivated. By day, nothing was in sight from the place, but as night came on, we began to see many other islands hard by, some larger, some smaller, and they were like fire in color. We also saw another country below with cities in it and rivers and seas and forests and mountains." This we inferred to be our own world. So during the day, you can't see the stars, but once it was nighttime from the moon, you could see the other stars, which are here represented as islands. So putting on into the shore, Lucian and his men are captured by guards riding massive vultures that have 3 heads. They're taken to the king Endymion, who in Greek myth was initially the lover of Zeus, but then when Zeus asked him what he wanted, he says, "To be forever asleep so I can stay beautiful forever." Right? It's lovely. And then so the moon falls in love with him and has 50 kids by him. Which one of the things that I think is interesting, we don't actually hear if he wakes up. So if we're connecting all these stories together, I think, well, I guess the moon doesn't believe in consent, and doesn't believe in protection either, I guess. All right, so Endymion, who here is the king of the moon, says that he's going to wage war on the sun and try to take some territory to settle a colony. Now, a colony settling is an important part of Greek thought because if you ever go to, have you ever been to Greece? Oh man, you should go. It's beautiful, but it's also you'll discover very quickly that there's very little arable land outside of the cities. So when the population starts to grow, you need to get rid of these people, and then you sort of send them off to form colonies. Well, I mean, when you also see how rocky the terrain is, or how rough the seas could have been, you just understand how much these people must have fucking hated each other, right? to bother to leave your little hovel, go and steal their stuff after marching up and down a mountain. I mean, it really is incredible. So the idea of colonizing was really important to these people. It gives them a system of trade, gives them a way of getting wealth and perhaps food back from other places, but also it's a way of leaching out this population. So the moon wants to send a colony. He initially sent it to the sun, then found out it was inhabited, and were driven off, and so now he's going to take it all by force. Okay, so the armies of the sun and the moon, when we read about in the story, reveal a deep natural focus, not a technological focus. So they have all the sorts of imagery that you would expect, but instead of metal for a helmet or a breastplate, they have large beams for a head, and then stiff legume petals for the breastplate. The heavy infantry were carrying mushroom shields with asparagus spears. The slingers wouldn't throw rocks, but they would throw radishes, which the narrator tells us don't just kill a man right away, but make them smell real bad. So we have a continuation of these ideas, and instead of elephants or horses, each side has massive insects or birds to ride on. Next slide, please. And in fact, to be able to get these people to go fight, Endymion has his spider army create a massive web upon which both sides can fight. So he takes he creates a sort of a web platform from the moon to the morning star, which is Venus. Actually, is Venus the first star we can see in the morning here too, or is it just in lower latitudes?
It is.
Okay. Yeah, so before the sun rises, the first bright light in the star, that is that is Venus. And so they create this bridge out of web work, and then they go to fight. So before we talk about this position or the resolution of the battle, I want to point out that this one aspect of the novum that Lucian is using. We talked about colonization and warfare as important parts, but when we take it to these sort of fantastical, heightened worlds, it becomes ultimately an anxiety over the role of technology. So in this place, he and his men's weapons are really ineffective against the hard natural items that we have there. Later on in the story, when he and his men get swallowed by the whale, and there are various other peoples in there who are using natural weaponry, bones and such, to fight against Lucian and his troops, he's able to cut through them entirely. So on Earth, technology is the way to go, but once we achieve these sort of heightened areas, technology is insufficient. It's working in concert with nature. That's the way to achieve the heights they're able to do, not dominate nature the way that humans on Earth use technology to. Those of you who are fans of Ewoks, we can see that with the Stormtroopers, right? So the natural versus the technological there, although it doesn't work out quite so well for them. Or in Return of the Sith, or Revenge of the Sith, we have the Battle of Kashyyyk, the Wookiees versus the clones, or versus the droids, right? So there again, we have this emphasis on technology versus the natural. That's at play there. Okay, so the moon initially wins the battle, setting up a trophy. The word trophy comes from tropeion, which just means to turn, the place where the battle was turned. So you put down armor, next slide please. You put down armor on the place where, there we go. So when Thanos does his snap and he retires, he puts up what to those of us classicists looks very clearly like a tropeion, right? So you put up a piece of armor where the tide turned, where the battle was won, and so the moon troops put up a tropeion, they start looting the dead, but the sun sends reinforcements and winds up murderizing most of the moon troops and capturing, you like murderizing? All right, and capturing Lucian and his men. Right. So next slide, please. All right. So for us, we were taken off to the sun that day, our hands tied behind our backs with a section of spider web. The enemy decided not to lay siege to the city, but on their way back, they built a wall through the air so the rays of the sun could no longer reach the moon. The wall was double, made of clouds, so that a genuine eclipse of the moon took place, and she was completely enshrouded in unbroken night. Hard pressed by this, Endymion sent and begged them to pull down the construction and let them lead their lives in darkness. He promised to pay tribute, to be an ally and not make war again, and volunteered to give hostages for this. So they wound up making a peace treaty, and here are some of the items of it that I think are interesting. All right, so the Sunites, the people in the sun, tear down the dividing wall and don't invade the moon again, and they make over prisoners of war, each set at a ransom, so that's how Lucian gets out. The Moonites permit the stars to be autonomous and don't make war on the Sunites, right? So here we see the problem of empire. That the issue is that the moon's trying to conquer and colonize other places, and the sun instead wants everyone to be free. So this is sort of an ideal situation. Let's see. Each country will aid the other if attacked. Yearly tribute, the king of the Moonites pay the king of the Sunites 10,000 gallons of dew, because the moon makes dew, and give 10,000 people as hostages. Now hostages, we tend to think of in a bad way, of something to be rescued. But in the ancient world, actually, hostages were a useful way of gaining cross-cultural knowledge. Right? The Host route is the same route as hospital or hospitality, because what you do is the elite men would send their sons and daughters to go live in a foreign land where they would be kept. Now, if the conquered people would try to invade again, of course, the children would be murdered. But that's just a part of it. But otherwise, they learn the customs, the language, the habits, and wind up coming back to their own society as people who have this type of intercultural fluency. Some of our best histories from the ancient world are actually written by people who were hostages in Rome. And we have the Roman questions, which is really useful for us because a lot of things the Romans just took for granted. Well, this Greek from Thebes sets out to say, well, why do Romans do that? And it's actually really quite fascinating. So, so the hostages, that is a positive term. And they wind up deciding to have a colony in common. So the colony on the Morning Star should be planted in common, and anyone who so desires may take part, right? So peace is made, prisoners return, Endymion's so grateful that he offers his son to Lucian in marriage. And here is another noam that I think is going to be really fascinating for us, because he offers his son in marriage, right? So if you're squinting and thinking it seems strange to have a male-male marriage done as a type of formal peace treaty, well, listen to how this idyllic society, this ideal society up on the moon breeds. Slide, please. All right. In the first place, there is the fact that they are not born of women, but of men. They marry men and do not even know the word woman at all. Up to the age of 25, each is a wife, and then thereafter a husband. They carry their children in the calf of the leg instead of the belly. When conception takes place, the calf begins to swell. In course of time, they cut it open to deliver the child dead, and they bring it to life by putting in the wind with its mouth open. Now, it seems to me the term belly of the leg comes to us Greeks from there, says the leg performs the function of a belly with them. So other than what is really just a miserable pun about what we call a calf, that they call the belly of the leg, that he then uses to talk about procreation here, we can see, I think, one of the ways that Lucian is trying to point to what counts as the ideal society. In fact, the translator is going to obscure something here. So we have this a utopian society because everyone passes through all the roles in the society, right? Youth and womanliness are tied together. So until 25, each is a wife, but once they achieve adulthood, they pass into the masculine role, becoming a husband. So for those of you who are grammar nerds, gametai there, which our translator says be a wife, is the passive form of be married. So they are married, and then game is the active form, they marry, right? So, which makes sense if they don't have the word for woman. Lucian is being very clever here by using the active versus passive of the Greek verb there. So yeah, so there's so I think by reflecting on what makes a society idyllic, we can see an important part. Next slide, please. Of how they keep from being fractious. So I don't think he's making a gender argument here, actually. Not that we fight because they're women, which is kind of the Pandora story, that men were all fine until Pandora opens her box, and then men start fighting with each other, right? Take that as you will, you can take it as I intended. Actually, the word that picks this, the urn, not boxes are made of box with different etymology, is also the word for womb in ancient Greek. Take my myth class if you want more about this. Right. So I don't think he's making a gender argument, but I think he's making an argument about how everyone embodies every role in the society, right? So every citizen gets to live both halves of these elements of society. First acted upon and then acting. So even in the society of Lucian's day, women were, for the most part, stuck in the passive role, and in the Roman army, if a man were caught playing the part of a woman, is how it's described in law, then he was beaten to death by his fellow comrades. It was seen as such a violently unmanly thing to do. Acting in the passive role in a male-male sexual relationship. So grammatically, I think this is making an argument about how power works if everyone has a chance to live through all the roles, and it levels the playing field and makes people equal. He also has other Noah in this section that hit on the things that make us human: sex, death and burial, eating and excretion. So another thing, they have artificial parts that are sometimes of ivory and sometimes with the pore of wood, and they make use of them in intercourse. When a man grows old, he doesn't die, but is dissolved like smoke and turns into air. They all eat the same food. They light a fire and cook frogs on the coals. They have quantities of frogs that fly about in the air. And while they're cooking, they just sit about them as if they're at table and sniff up the rising smoke and gorge themselves. This is the food they eat, and their drink is air, which is squeezed into a cup that yields a liquid like dew. They're not subject to calls of nature, which in fact they have no means of answering. Another important function too is not provided as one would expect, but with the hollow of the knee. Right? If you think about men getting porn from the calves, it makes sense. I'm just going to dwell for a moment on a conversation I had with my girlfriend's daughter last week, where she asked the question at dinner, if there's something that you never wanted to do again for the rest of your life, what would it be? Now, her response was taxes, which I think is pretty funny, because as a 10-year-old, I doubt that she's using, Form 1040 Schedule 1, Line 8B, income from hobbies to describe her lemonade stand. But so she said taxes, and I said, I'd like to not poop again, right? I mean, just think about it, like you're camping or at a music festival, it'd be really nice not to have to use those facilities, right? So my view of what is an ideal society. So thank you, Emilia, wherever you are, for making me think about that. Here we have another version of this ideal society, right? They don't eat food, they just sniff the savor, and so they never have to do anything that other humans have to do, right? So our answers, tax and poop, reflect our respective concerns about how we navigate society. And so Lucian does the same by describing sex toys, no funerals or burial, or eating solid food, or going to the bathroom. All right, so after his time on the moon, Lucian and his crew sail back to Earth, go to the underworld, meet all the famous heroes, get swallowed by a whale, and eventually sail their way back home. Okay, so as I'm sort of rounding third and trying to wrap up my remarks here, I'll sum up what I've said and talk a bit about why I think it's important, and then connect it with Taming the Shrew and Return to the Forbidden Planet. Okay, so science fiction, tales of sailing to the stars, meeting people who live on other planets, seeing how the worlds are similar or dissimilar to ours, allows an author to reflect upon their own society, hypothesize about alternative ways of structuring it, and dealing with technology. Lucian gives us a literal Star Wars that can be resolved through cooperation and application of diplomacy. Society can be utopian if it can just harness nature and not fight with it, and if they allow all people to be equal. He's not, as I said, it's not that there aren't women in the book. And there are women all over the place, except for they are oftentimes scary creatures. We have magical figures, we have goddesses, we have sort of half women, half grape leaves that produce wine. When they try to seduce some of Lucian's men, they sort of graft themselves onto the men, and all the rest sort of run away. So it's not that women don't exist, they're just scary and to be avoided. All right. All right, let's see. I know, news you can use, practical information, right? All right, so, as I said before, I think that the trading of roles decreases hierarchy and increases respect. So by noting all these things that are crummy and challenging about human existence, he's reinforcing what makes us special, all right? So could you put up the last slide, please? All right, okay. You may have seen that. All right, so this leads me to the productions that we're seeing this week. So Return to the Forbidden Planet is kind of a Tempest, done in the jukebox musical type of setting that's set in sort of classic science fiction, sort of as you can see around us, which is why I want to sit in the captain's chair. Or it's actually not just one setting, it's a mixture of settings. And I think that the art design here we can see has things from different times and eras of history, right? So such as the captain's chair, the sort of the red detailing the way that the banister is working here, evoking Star Trek: The Original Series, the images that we see from Firefly, the Prospero character that we have in this version of the Tempest looks like a mad scientist with wild white hair and a lab coat. The magical dimension of the story gets all reduced to science, right? It's part of mad science. Ariel is not a spirit, but he's a robot. What was the name of the guy who played Ariel? Owen. Yeah, it was very funny. That was spectacular. Right. So so we can see why when Bob Carlton tries to modernize this to the late 20th century, I don't hear he died in the 80s. Was that late 80s? 80s. All right. So that when he's trying to modernize these things, he's incorporating elements that would have fit our explanatory models that come from our preoccupation with science fiction. The wizardry and spirits become mad science and Freudian psychology. Okay, so Return to the Forbidden Planet is also kind of a jukebox musical as far as Shakespeare quotations are concerned. As you're listening to it, there's lots of lines you'll recognize if you have even just a passing knowledge of the bard, including a terrible Hamlet soliloquy pun that made me groan really loud. which for me is really terrible. You know, I appreciate a good pun. But even all the new lines are Shakespearean, right? They sound like Shakespeare, but they're all new. So there's no contrast between the old speech and the new speech. There's really no. The only friction that we get is in the use of the music. But since that is something that music is a different type of heightened language, you know, because we have normal speech that then gets put into rhyme and rhythm and meter. And so by that it gets transformed into sort of specialized language. So that's something that I think doesn't really cause a problem when we're thinking about the way that Shakespeare is being used here. And I would hazard that the way that Shakespeare is being used, both in that production, also in The Tempest, as you take it out into the schools, is a lot like the way that we're looking at classic science fiction, right? So the language which you all did not modernize, right? You've kept true to the original, is kind of hard to apprehend. But there is a utility to that because it provides almost a force field around the concepts that you have there. So the same way that when we're looking at this retro set for science fiction, and we consider how the language of the characters is being used in that to advance ideas that perhaps don't fit in our modern world. Likewise, even though it's a modern dress version of Tempest, of Taming the Shrew, we still have that language as a way of protecting us from these ideas, that we're able to take the things that we find surprising and offensive and keep it sort of clearly locked off in ways that if we were modernizing the language, it wouldn't allow us to do. I confess that I was shocked by Taming. I realized that I was remembering the Moonlighting version from the 80s, which was highly modernized. In fact, Tia and I watched it Saturday night and it's on YouTube. I think it's worth a see because you can see the way that these people are trying to transform the story to make it fit with the ethos of the 80s and their particular time. Somebody in the talkback asked a better version of the question that I wanted to ask, and then somebody else gave a response that I thought was better than the one that I wanted to ask as well. So, because somebody asked, why is it responsible to show children relationships that are gaslighting and controlling if we want to have them not have those relationships today? And someone pointed out that one of the things that could be useful about this type of thing is that it's sort of big and cartoonish. You know, Petruchio is so extreme. So even though there's a happy end in the end, we don't think that he is an admirable character. And so if we think about watching this play and seeing these large cartoonish things, well, perhaps it will give the students a chance to reflect upon, well, you know, my date was unhappy that I had dessert at homecoming. You know, maybe they made a crack about my weight. Or perhaps there's something about the controlling nature of the way these people are interacting with each other. You know, is your partner gaslighting you when they say they didn't drink the full six-pack, but you can see the cans in the trash can, you see how glassy their eyes were. So I think that if we treat Shakespeare like we do science fiction, especially classic science fiction, a way for us to view the ideas of the past in this sort of safe box, almost like a holodeck program, right? That is something that is bounded and clear and away from us. It allows us to then use that as an opportunity to reflect upon what would have made sense in those own days, take it from the sort of new historical approach, but also have a chance to reflect on what we do today as well. Okay, well, thank you.
Thank you.
Was there a time, do you think, that that things became a lot of what Lucian did was man versus nature, really, and even like the stuff on the moon with the mushrooms and the, you know, like it was still nature based. Like, was there a turning point specifically when it became man versus machine?
Oh yes, actually,
like you know, Philip K. Dick, obviously with Blade Runner, when Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, and William Gibson with Technomancer, and you know, any of these things that become it's us versus these things that we've created.
Well, yeah. So I have two answers for that, and I think that's a really great question, because this issue of of technology as something that to be concerned or feared about goes back to the first ships, right? So the history of navigation, at least in the myth, was seen as something that was actually really terrible because now people become merchants. And what a merchant does is they take something that has a value and they sell it for not that value, right? So this initial technology of being able to transit long distances is one thing that people say, well, we should just get back to farming. Cato the Elder was approached and said, so what's the best way of making money? He said, farming. What's the second best way? Farming. What's the third best way? Farming. So, well, what about being a merchant? It's like, what about murder? Right? So there's part of this where, yeah, the things that help out humans are seen as a fall away from the sort of Edenic state that came beforehand. So on the one hand, we have this one set of things, which is things were better when we didn't have any technology. Now that we do, we've got warfare, greed, etc. Now the other half of this ties into all these works that deal with the problem of slavery. Okay, so there were some people that thought, like Aristotle, that slaves were natural, or enslaved people. Sorry, we've changed the terminology. That enslaved people are naturally enslaved. Like the word slave, servus in Latin, means people who are saved behind. So when you sack a city and you got these people there, you should murder them, or you can save them. And because they didn't take care of themselves well enough to defend their city, well, that shows they aren't capable of ruling over themselves. And so enslaved people, women, and children are sort of put in the same category. Now, here's where it gets interesting. Slavery is a problem. Right? You have people who clearly look like you, act like you. In the Roman system, they can become freed. But there are in mythology the idea that Hephaestus, the smith of the gods, had tools that could work themselves. And they say, oh my God, it must be so great if we didn't have to have people. You gotta feed them, you gotta take care of them. If they get sick, you gotta, pretend like you're calling the doctor or something, you gotta give them clothing and things. But wouldn't it be awesome if we could just not have slaves because all the tools did their own work, right? But no one ever makes the connection to say, well, we should not have slaves, right? It's all an issue of like, well, technology could be the way to get us out of that situation. So the problem of having slaves in your household is one that could have been solved by the sort of magical, wondrous technology thing there. So the
Well, that's the argument of the cotton gin, right? And that was the big term, was machinery, and then people were like, oh, we don't need that anymore. And so the North was like, we've got machines. So
yes,
that's right there. I mean, that happens.
Yeah, or Maynard Keynes had this thought that by today we'd all be working 5 hours a week because technology is going to improve things so much that we'll just be lying back and eating figs and having sex and doing a lot of nothing, right? But I don't know about you, but everybody I know is working harder than ever before, even though we have this rich panoply of devices that make our lives so much easier. Yeah. Problem. Okay. Anything else people want to talk about? Or do we have to get the next person up here?
It's not till 7, right?
Okay, let's have pass now.
Anybody else? I mean, I can keep talking science fiction all day. I mean, you guys want to keep talking?
Well, do you have anything else?
Who are some of your favorite writers? I mean, you've gone sort of through the early history of it, but who do you point people toward now? I mean, you talked about Heinlein a little bit and William Gibson and
yeah, let's see.
Asimov
Well, my absolute
Jim
favorite
Butcher.
author of all time is Ovid, but he's not so science fiction-y. He did write a great book on how to pick up chicks and what to do when you're dumped. It's sort of the object of my main focus.
We refer to it in Truth. So.
Oh, that's right. Yes, you do. The Arts of Love. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, and so I read it, and it's pretty. The first book is, here guys, this is what you do, and the second book is, here girls, this is how you don't listen to the guys because this is what they're going to be trying to do. It's great.
Exactly. Well, and in fact, sort of my research right now is using game theory to understand the work because it's it's an open playbook for both sexes.
Yeah.
And the ultimate argument that I make is that there is that once both people play the game perfectly, then it's a much more efficient transfer of what each person wants. And so in Ovid's view, women want stuff and men want sex. And so, you know, the conflict, if you are both naive players, is one's trying to get over on the other, and things don't really work out that well. But then ultimately, if both people understand the rules of the game and play them as if they're both naive, then, you know, things are super efficient and effective. I have a piece that's coming out soon, which Ovid is all about mutual orgasm, right? That's the big climax of both his pieces. And so it's like, why does it make sense in a world where men hold all the cards to advocate for that? But that's, you know, I'll always put my plug for Ovid. Let's see, yeah, Heinlein has been a big, I've been rereading White Plague by Frank Herbert, which is a sort of fascinating work that hypothesizes what happens if somebody creates a virus that only kills women. What would happen to the world if that happened? So as a guy getting revenge for a terrorist act. So I guess I've been reading sort of the more classic stuff. I did sort of get through a bunch of the Dresden Files. I think that those were really really fun.
They're great, yeah. And
yeah, what are your
very
favorite
easy, very easy reads, and yeah, they're very good. Why the Last Man? Have you read it's a comic series, but
No.
Why the Last Man is sort of the opposite of the Herbert story. It's there's only a plague kills all the men. And there's only there one guy wakes up and nobody knows that he's alive, and it's he and a monkey, and the monkey is also male, and it's the two of them. And his name is Yorick, and they made a really not great adaptation on Hulu, and it got canceled after the first season. They were originally trying to make it for HBO, but it runs, I think, 10 graphic, or 10 like 5, whatever their collections, comic collections, or whatever. It's like 90 issues maybe, maybe not even that long, but it tells the whole story, and he's trying to find his girlfriend, and there's no transportation anymore, like the whole, everything is sort of gone The Stand crazy. And so it's a very interesting thing.
I used to be really into, apocalyptic, especially like virus kills everybody sorts of literature.
I'm always big at post-apocalyptic kind of. The Stand is one of my favorite novels of all time, so I like all of that. Even the Road and stuff like that, I think is great.
Yeah. Well, I was like, Bradbury touches that. Like, he's not necessarily science fiction, but I think he falls into that speculative. Like, he's definitely right there. Yeah.
Well, and one of the
And some Lovecraft too, but Lovecraft is a little more racist than some of the other.
which is why Lovecraft Country was so great.
So great, yeah. Like
Yeah.
I'm a huge Philip K. Dick guy. I like most of the adaptations that they made. Which Man in the High Castle is Philip K. Dick too, and of course Blade Runner, but. Minority Report is a really solid adaptation, probably better than the actual short story. But
Yeah, well, there's a lot of
say the same about Blade Runner, really. But
the idea that your agent will take you to the woods and chain you to a desk, give you a bucket to piss in and a pile of amphetamines, and say, finish your contract by Monday. I think that's why some of these are uneven. But yeah, there's the vision that he had, I think, is really spectacular.
yeah, and that's always an impressive, as a writer, that's always an impressive thing to me. Is like, hey, even as a guy who thinks up stuff, it's impressive to see people thinking up stuff and go, man, wish I'd have thought that's a great idea. Like that, how did it? Where did they pull that from? Because that's such a great concept or whatever.
Have you seen Better Off Ted?
No.
It was a short-run series. It was an ABC show. Comedy. It was in a research and development company, and it was just always something ridiculous. Like they were going to replace everything with sensors, And so he was making a commentary because it wouldn't pick up the African American people. So they had to hire people to walk around with the African American people, and then they had to hire people to walk around with them because of. But they were making political commentary
Yeah.
with the idea of technology, and he did it. Did you see the series?
Yes.
It was very clever, but it was what you were saying, wherever you're at in that area. That was 10 years ago, maybe.
Yeah, I remember when the Connect didn't work with people who did not look like me.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, I think that was, and they were doing all kinds of stuff. I mean, it was just, and I guess I didn't think about it being science fiction, but it really was.
well, yeah, and I think that it really does help to put our hands around arguments that we might otherwise find odious, right? So, like in The Expanse, which I think is again, it's hard SF, so it's no technology in there that couldn't be technology today.
Right.
And I remember there's a part in season 3 where a person who's not from Earth winds up sort of walking around San Francisco, right? And it was playing out the implications of universal basic income. The world that they paint is not, and I'm somebody who is sort of a fan of the concept. I'd like to try it, and I'm glad that people are trying it now. But the sort of the natural evolution of, well, everybody has enough to live on, but that doesn't mean that there aren't enough jobs to go around. You know, people are living lives of despair, even though their basic needs are covered.
Yeah.
You know, or I saw a really interesting post about why Star Trek shows us that the future is actually a hellscape, because it talks about Picard going back and they still have primogeniture for who was going to get the vineyard, or when Kirk is riding his, the new Kirk was riding his motorcycle past those sheaves of monoculture, as they said it, right? That we still have bad farming practices where it's, you know, just wheat, not diverse. So like the idea that, well, in the replicator future, well, of course you can just do whatever you want. You can be whoever you want to be, provided that you sort of study hard and have the aptitude, because money doesn't mean anything anymore, except for when it does, right? So again, yeah, it's a way of I've got a particular political point of view, and I read, I think, pretty widely, but sometimes science fiction is able to, like Petruchio, give these big cartoonish ways of understanding the opposing point of view.
You mentioned Ursula K. Le Guin, and if I'm remembering, there's a book, is it Heart of Darkness or Lone of Darkness? It's part of one of her trilogies.
Yeah.
But it kind of really does a great job of the idea of like cultural transference, but also relatable. Like it really deals with gender in that book, and it's like a.
Was that an icy planet? Am I remembering this one correctly?
Yes.
Yeah.
And then there's like an advanced intergalactic society that's trying to get an allegiance of all the intergalactic societies, but they go to a more primitive planet, and they're like beyond gender constructs basically, but then they go to a more primitive planet where they're sort of the embodiment of both genders in each person, but also it's a little different with different tribes or parts of the planet. And I just thought it was really interesting because it shows like at first the person is like aghast at like what they're seeing. It's kind of like an abomination, right? But then they spend a whole time and a whole year, and then the people from their intergalactic planet actually come down, and by the end of it, that person is looking at their own kind as almost their alien now. And, or like, it's just kind of, it's interesting, and I think about Ursula K. Le Guin when she was writing that probably in like the 60s or 70s, that it was more probably a discussion on gender roles, whereas now we might actually find it like on gender itself, just like with today's issues. Or always I've loved how science fiction kind of takes you beyond some of the political issues of the current moment, but in a way that kind of strips it away from the divisiveness that actually...
Left Hand of Darkness.
Left Hand of Darkness, yes. Thank you. Sorry.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut up your punchline there. That's but no, yeah, and I think that one of the things that she's responding to is transformations the way anthropology is done, right?
Yes, that's exactly what I was thinking about.
Yeah,
When you were mentioning that, like, how travel always does that in the scientific world, but we have turned, yeah, and it is cultural transference, right? That's like the anthropologic term for it.
hmm Yeah, I mean, again, a very useful way of thinking through that. And the issues of gender, again, in the time that it was written, where we got these massive transformations. I mean, my dissertation was on countercultural masculinity and the Roman Republic. And when we have these big times of transformation, people get really anxious. And so, our literature can reflect that as well. There's Octavia Butler wrote a really interesting book. So what's it's got the
Was
rule
it
over.
Wild Seed? Because
No.
I know that one also deals with that.
It's about a sort of a colonizing, sort of mostly like sort of moving vegetation type of society where humans are no longer able to procreate with each other. They have to use this third term, the ouloi, in between. And so it's like how society changes when
Oh, yeah.
men and women no longer have sex. They have to have sex through this intermediary. And that was really fascinating work.
Remember that? I also like Octavia Butler.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, some thing here, that's good. You guys think on that?
Yeah, so you mentioned Lucius, the guy.
Lucian.
Lucian, right. So he was a satirist, and if this is the first example of like a science fiction story, it was an unusual style of writing for the time because he had to illustrate that everything I'm writing is false. All of this is a lie. So what do we know about the impact of this piece on the community? Like, was he burned at the stake after writing this? Were people like, oh my gosh, there's two dudes that got married, and that's awful. You know, like that. Like, do we know anything? Was this text referenced elsewhere, or what was the cultural implication?
Yeah, so for the most part, sort of rolled up in the rest of his works. I mean, it's something that not a lot of classics even work on. It's not that famous a piece. I mean, one of the things that I think is generically, like with the genre that it's in, romance novels were the most popular type of prose literature, and this is not a romance. And so it sort of was in the byways of this thing. The male thing that I mentioned with that marriage and the use of the grammar there, would have been surprising to some people, but also at this time we start having our first major books on astrology. And one thing that's interesting about the way astrology handles these things is it's provided. So up until astrology comes in from the East, Romans and Greeks, like they basically had a very short-term window on what counts as prophecy. Like, is this thing that I'm doing right here going to be okay? Not, how you're born is going to determine your future. So in our first handbooks on astrology, we have things like, well, if you're Aquarius with Saturn rising, I don't know what any of these terms mean, so I might probably use the wrong ones. But if you're Aquarian with Saturn rising, well, it means that you're going to gamble, and you're going to want to sleep with people of your same sex, and you're not going to be able to eat radishes, right? So it's like that's all just folded into it. And I would also say that female sexuality is something that men didn't care about because you can't get pregnant from it, right? So we have evidence of women getting married to each other in the early church until the first major renovation when Cyril comes in. There's oh gosh, I don't remember the name of the book. I use it all the time. But anyway, yeah, so Lucian just wrote a lot of wacky stuff, and so people just took it as part of that. But yeah, the idea of the sort of sailing out, well, one of the things is they do wind up in the underworld, which in Homer is just on the plane of the earth, just beyond Gibraltar by a little bit. And so the sailing to the stars was new, but a lot of the other was not so much.
So do you think it, like how sci-fi is political commentary? I mean, so was the work was also political commentary? Like what?
I think it probably could be. I don't have a lot of good evidence. Like I said, not a lot of people have written on this. It's just part of the broader sweep of things. I'm sorry, I cut you off before you finished.
Oh, no, that was it?
Yeah, so we do have you know, plenty of ways that people are investigating the world around them, and I think that this was just another one of them. But he also wrote a lot of other like really strange stuff. He's a fun author to poke through. I see people crowding the stage. Is it time to? All right.
Probably good time to wrap it up.
Okay.
Thank you so much.
Yeah. Well, thank you for inviting me,
Thank you.
and thank you for letting me see the big chair.